The Notebook of Doom. Sneeze of the ОСТО SCHNOZZA. Chapter 1, A Close-Knit Group. Wait up, Dottie! Alexander shouted. He jogged to catch up with his friend as she skipped along the forest path. No way! Dottie called back. I love SSMP meetings. SSMP stood for Super Secret Monster Patrol, a group of kids sworn to protect the town of Stormont from monsters. Alexander was the group's leader. Dottie was its newest member. They soon came upon an old caboose, covered with vines. Gosh, said Alexander. Our headquarters is overgrown. At least the flowers smell good. Dottie said, sniffing the air. Oh, what's this? There was some red yarn tangled in the vines. The yarn wiggled. Someone's pulling the other end, Dottie said. She followed the yarn, which looped around the caboose and under the back door. Dottie opened the door. Alexander followed her inside. Rawr! A two-headed creature leaped out from behind a table. Monster! Dottie cried, jumping back. Watch out! It's a nitwit, said Alexander. Clackety-click! The monster wiggled its claws. How do we stop it, Salamander? Asked Dottie. Salamander was Alexander's nickname. His friends called him that at home, at school, or when they were under attack by a two-headed yarn creature. Quick! We need to unravel it, said Alexander. Dottie leaped toward the monster and grabbed a big fistful of yarn. She yanked hard. The monster spun around, crashing into a shelf. Clonk! An old tin coffee can fell to the floor. Something fuzzy rolled out. A horrible smell filled the caboose. Time out, said one of the monster's heads. Pop! Pop! The nitwit pulled off its yarn ball heads. Inside were the other two members of the SSMP. Nikki pulled out a stopwatch. 47 seconds, she said. A new record. What just happened? Asked Dottie, holding her nose from the stench. That was an SSMP monster fighting test, said Alexander. You did awesome. Dottie grinned. Alexander's eyes watered from the smell of the stinky fuzzy thing. What was in that old can, anyhow? He asked. Opening a window. Rip read the label on the can. Funky cheese, he said. Why would the old SSMP keep dash? Ho-o-ronk. A loud honking sound rattled the windows. The four monster fighters gasped. Is this part of the test? Asked Dottie. No, said Alexander. That sounded like a moose. Or a foghorn, said Nikki. Or a burping bullfrog, said Rip. Something rammed into the caboose. Junk fell off the walls. Alexander, Rip, Nikki, and Dottie fell into a tumble of yarn and funky cheese. A pointy gray horn punched through the wall, then ripped back out, leaving a huge hole. What was that? Asked Dottie. It looked like a rhino horn, said Nikki. Alexander heard a snuffling sound, then a sharp intake of breath. Whoo-ee. A gust of wind blasted through the hole, sending papers flying. Pumm. The SSMP heard heavy footsteps running into the woods, and then, silence. Chapter 2, Slime Time. Is the monster gone? Asked Dottie. Rip stuck his head through the giant hole in the wall. No sign of it, he said. Come on, said Alexander. Let's see how bad this looks from the outside. I'll use our new emergency exit, said Rip. He jumped through the hole, hitting the ground with a splat. Alexander, Nikki, and Dottie used the door. Are you all right, Rip? Asked Alexander. Nikki started laughing. Rip was lying in a pool of drippy green slime. Join me for a swim? He asked. Bletch, said Dottie. Slime is everywhere. And it ruined the flowers. The monster with the horn must have made this mess, right? Asked Nicky. Yes, said Alexander, quickly unzipping his backpack. He paused. And then re-zipped it. Crud. I keep forgetting the notebook was stolen. Stolen by our teacher, added Dottie. Dr. Tallow was no teacher, said Rip. She was an evil, shape-shifting blob. Yeah, and she gave our notebook to the boss monster, said Nicky. Alexander sighed. On his first day in Sturmont, he had uncovered an old notebook full of monster facts. It had helped the SSMP defeat tons of monsters, but now it was gone. We've got to get the notebook back, said Alexander. How? Said Rip. We don't know who the boss monster is. Dottie gasped. Could the boss monster be the thing that just rammed our headquarters? Maybe, said Alexander. Let's write down what we know about this caboose crasher. Alexander scribbled some notes on a scrap of paper. Not much to go on, is it? Said Nicky. Rip flung slime at Alexander. Sounds like this meeting is over, he said. Let's break for dinner. Wait! I almost forgot, said Dottie, opening her bunny backpack. You're invited to my birthday party. She handed out colorful envelopes. Thanks, said Alexander. Pirates? Said Rip. Some. Can't wait, Dottie, said Nicky. See you guys tomorrow. Chapter 3, Sunday Mail. P.U., said Alexander's dad. What's that dog-awful smell? Alexander had just walked into the kitchen. He sniffed his shirt. Funky cheese, said Alexander. Why don't you go take a bath and unfunky yourself while I finish dinner, said his dad. Alexander tromped upstairs. 15 minutes later, he tromped back down, in pajamas. Ah. Squeaky clean, his dad said. And here's your bathrobe, fresh from the dryer. Thanks, Dad, said Alexander, slipping into the robe. It felt soft and warm, but smelled flowery. My robe smells like a rose garden. I may have overdone it on the fabric softener, said his dad. But it beats stinky cheese. Speaking of cheese, let's eat, said Alexander, taking a seat. His dad scooped lasagna onto Alexander's plate. Oh, you got mail today, he said. On a Sunday? Asked Alexander. Yeah, said his dad. It must have been hand-delivered. He handed Alexander an envelope. Alexander frowned as he opened it. Alexander, your teacher, Dr. Tallow, no longer works at Sturmont Elementary. That's no surprise. As Alexander chewed his lasagna, he thought of Dr. Tallow melting into a goop blob, attacking the SSMP, and then hardening into a spiky statue. Therefore, her students have been moved into other classrooms. You, Alexander, will now report to my office on the 13th floor for one-on-one lessons. Until tomorrow, Principal Vanderpants. Alexander dropped his fork. You are so lucky, Al, said Alexander's dad, reading over his shoulder. Just think, private lessons with your principal. Class without my friends? Thought Alexander. I'd rather be trampled by a caboose crasher. Chapter 4, The Upstairs Basement. Since moving to Sturmont, Alexander had been swallowed by a fish monster, squished by a bubble-wrap mummy, and zapped by electric bugs. He'd survived each attack for 2 reasons. 1, he had the notebook. 2, his friends were by his side. Now, neither of these things was true. And to top it all off, his new teacher was the strictest, most serious person he'd ever known. Alexander dragged himself into the shiny, towering lobby of his school. His shoulders slumped on the long escalator ride to the 13th floor. Alexander had been all over his new school, but this was his first trip to the principal's office. First of many, he thought. He plodded down the hallway, pausing at a large, stone door. Everything in the school was shiny and high-tech, except for this door. Alexander cupped his ear to the cold stone. Scritch! A faint scraping sound came from the door. Alexander! Alexander jumped. He turned to see Principal Vanderpants standing nearby, arms folded. This way, Alexander. Miss Vanderpants led him down the hall to her office. Everything in the room was clean and gray. Except for a large white bucket near the door. Didn't Nikki say something about a bucket when she got in trouble last week? Alexander thought. Have a seat, said Miss Vanderpants. I expect you to work hard even when I am dealing with principal matters. Any questions? Said Alexander. Why does our school have a basement on the 13th floor? Miss Vanderpants narrowed her eyes. It's a storage room, she said. Now, shall we get to work? She handed Alexander a spelling worksheet. Alexander started writing. The room was silent except for his scratching pencil. At one point, the phone rang. Miss Vanderpants, said Miss Vanderpants. Alexander listened while he worked. I'm not surprised the milk went bad. That cooler has been overheating since our electricity problem a while back, said Miss Vanderpants. What? Someone stole the spoiled milk? Well, clean up the mess and dash. The call was interrupted by a terrible noise blaring through the window. Alexander gasped. The honk of the caboose crasher. Miss Vanderpants looked at Alexander. Then she slammed the phone down. I'll be right back. She marched out of the room. Did Miss Vanderpants hear the monster, too? Alexander wondered. I wish lunch would get here. I've got to tell my friends the caboose crasher is back. Chapter 5, Totally Uncool. The lunch line was empty by the time Alexander got to the cafeteria. He read the menu as he grabbed his tray. Alexander smelled a sharp, stinky odor. Ugh! What are they putting in those PBJs? He thought as he reached into the milk cooler. But instead of a milk carton, he had grabbed an ear. Eep! A frightened janitor stood up. Mr. Horsley, said Alexander. Besides being the janitor, Mr. Horsley was the school nurse, secretary, gym coach, and bus driver. He was also a former SSMP member. And he seemed to be the only grown-up who could see monsters. Oh! Alexander, said Mr. Horsley. He was holding a damp sponge. I thought the monster had come back. Monster? Asked Alexander. The monster who did this, whispered Mr. Horsley. He pointed to a gash on the cooler. Late last night, something tore into this cooler and stole all the spoiled milk, 984 cartons. Alexander frowned, thinking of the hole in the caboose. But that hole was roundish, this gash was jagged. It's like the thief used a giant can opener, thought Alexander. The milk thief sloshed sour milk all over the place. Mr. Horsley continued. And this smell is impossible to scrub out. Yeesh, said Alexander. Good luck. He left the lunch line and found his friends at a table. Salamander, said Rip. Welcome to the Cafeteria. Guess what, guys, said Alexander. I heard the caboose crashers honk again. Us, too, said Dottie. Earlier this morning. Did you see the monster, Salamander? Asked Nikki. Is that why you're late? No, said Alexander. My new teacher kept me past the bell. Yikes, Rip said, taking a bite of his sandwich. So who'd you get? Principal Vanderpants, said Alexander. PPPPBTHTHH. Rip sprayed PBJ all over the table. Vanderpants, he said. Yup, just her and me, said Alexander. Who did you guys get? I'm in Mrs. Clambert's class, said Dottie. Rip and I got Mrs. Felix, said Nikki. So, said Rip. What's Vanderpants like as a teacher? Strict, said Alexander. And strange. She has this white bucket. He turned to Nikki. Didn't you see it in her office before? Yeah, said Nikki. She kept lugging it around Nikki. Last Friday. Pretty wacko. All right, enough about our principal, said Dottie, grinning. Look what I brought. She took a pink cupcake from her lunchbox. My party's not until tomorrow, but I thought we could sneak a taste. She divided the cupcake into quarters. 3 seconds later, it was gone. Said Nikki. Strawberry's my favorite. Yum, said Rip, brushing a crumb from his cheek. Too bad we can't, he paused and began scratching his ears. Are you all right, Rip? Alexander asked. My ears are itching like crazy, he said. He scratched faster. Are you allergic to strawberries? Asked. No way. I eat them all the time, said Rip. Are my ears red? Dottie took a look. She said. They're actually turning blue. Alexander stood up. Come on, Rip. Let's get Nurse Horsley. Fine, Salamander, said Rip. Just don't let me miss recess. I have a perfect attendance record. Chapter 6, Disconnect the Dots. Ugh. Rip groaned. It feels like I'm wearing cactus earmuffs. Just keep moving, said Alexander. He herded Rip toward the broken cooler. Alexander did a double take. What is it? Said Rip. Are my ears bluer? He looked at his reflection in a spoon. Now his face was covered in blue spots. What is happening to me? Rip yelled. And where is Horsley? Mr. Horsley popped up, holding his smelly sponge. Here I am. He saw Rip's polka-dotted face and yelped, squeezing stinky water onto the floor. Come with me, he said. The 3 of them rushed to the nurse's office. Mr. Horsley tossed the sponge in a corner, washed his hands, and put on a stethoscope. Okay, said Mr. Horsley at last. I'm no doctor, but he paused. He and Alexander were both staring at Rip, wide-eyed. What now? Said Rip. Said Mr. Horsley. Those blue spots are gone. And your ears are both back to normal, said Alexander. Hello, handsome, said Rip, smiling at himself in the mirror. But what happened? Mr. Horsley frowned. I'm not sure. Are you allergic to anything? No, said Rip. Mr. Horsley pulled out a medical book. Let's see. Blue spots. Aquamarine bumps. Navy freckles. He closed the book. Nothing. Ho-orank. BLAM. The door slammed shut. Eep. Mr. Horsley dove under the cot. He looked toward the door.